My maternal grandmother, Alice Jane Whitehair, was the eldest daughter of William Joseph Whitehair, a compositor at the Sydney Morning Herald. William Joseph Whitehair's father was William Robert Whitehair, born in 1828 at St Pancras in the London slums. He was a bricklayer and plasterer who had arrived in Sydney with his wife and children in 1856. His father was named Peter, and that is as far as I can go back on the Whitehair side. Peter was a shoemaker living in St Pancras, north of Bloomsbury, in London, in the early 19th century. He married Sarah Churchill, whose mother was Sarah Dewsall. The Dewsall family can be traced back another 4 generations to the small rural village of Leinthall Starkes, near Ludlow and not far from the Welsh border. If there is one constant theme that runs through the lives of the Whitehairs and their ancestors, it is that of living in poverty, occasionally rising out of it and then being thrust back into it due to the early deaths of parents or to economic misfortunes. The furthest we can go back is to James Dewsall. James was probably a farm labourer, like most of the poorer classes of this time. He lived all of his life in Leinthall Starkes, a tiny village that still exists today. James had been born in 1650 when Oliver Cromwell ruled England in the great Republican experiment after the English Civil War. In 1674, James Dewsall married Elizabeth and had 7 children, 5 sons and 2 daughters. During James's lifetime, Oliver Cromwell's Republican government was overthrown, and the Stuart kings returned from exile after the Civil War, the first being Charles II. Before James Dewsall died in 1717, aged 67, the Stuarts had been exiled again and been replaced by the Hanoverian kings, the first of these being George I. However, it is doubtful that James Dewsall would have known much about these events, as he would have lived a very simple life trying to ensure that his family had enough to eat. James's eldest son Thomas lived all his days as a farm labourer, but a younger son, Edward, went to London, where he was financially successful. Thomas's son John Dewsall followed his uncle Edward to London in the 1740s, marrying Elizabeth Emmet in a clandestine ceremony because she was underage. They married in St Margaret's Church next to Westminster Abbey in 1747. A year later, John's uncle Edward died, bequeathing John 3 leasehold properties in nearby Marylebone. These may have been the basis for John's business dealings over the next 10 years in London. During these years, he and Elizabeth raised a young family in Marylebone. John Dewsall was sufficiently successful to be able to do this, moving his family just out of the city to live. In 1758, he was able to purchase a farm at Harrow on the Hill, about 15 miles northwest of London, today the site of an exclusive boys' school. In the official documentation of the time, John Dewsall's farm was described as
a cottage, 2 barns, 2 stables, orchard, gardens with land, pasture, heath, and a common pasture for all cattle.
At the same time, John moved into the higher levels of rural society as he was appointed to the position of High Constable of the Hundred of Gore. This curious and traditional title involved him in taking up a role of supervising the militia who kept the peace in the prosperous rural area of Pinner, Harrow, Hendon and Edgware. He only kept his position for 2 years, however, settling down to manage his country estate. John Dewsall died in 1767 at the relatively young age of 52. He was buried in the grounds of the family church of St John the Baptist in Pinner, a church building dating from the 14th century and still standing today. Later generations of Dewsalls sank into poverty again, and the next 2 generations lived on the land in increasingly difficult circumstances, becoming tenant farmers. One of John Dewsall's granddaughters married Richard Churchill at St John the Baptist Church, Pinner, in 1811. Richard was an agricultural labourer, and so the young couple would have been members of the rural lower classes. During this time, Britain was at war with Napoleon. After Napoleon's defeat, Britain entered a serious agricultural depression. Historians point out that the years 1815 to 1820 were probably the most wretched years in modern English history, and many in the countryside came close to starvation. There was constant fear of revolution. Conditions did not start to improve until the late 1830s. Richard and Sarah Dewsall raised their 4 young daughters during these very difficult times. Their eldest daughter, Sarah, ran away to London when she was only 15 to marry the young Peter Whitehair. Of the other daughters, Charlotte died young, while Eliza and Harriet both moved to London to work as servants, Eliza spending 3 months in jail for larceny, and her younger sister Harriet being a single mother whose illegitimate son grew up back in Pinner with his grandparents. No doubt these experiences would have been very typical of the rural poor at this time. At the age of 15, Sarah married Peter Whitehair in northern London in 1827. Peter himself was only 21, and it seems likely that he and Sarah either ran away together to London or that she met him there. They lived together at St Pancras and had 7 children, though 3 of these died as infants. At this time, they would have been living in slum conditions where overcrowding was endemic. Up to 90 people might be living in a 10-room house, and rents were exorbitant. Peter was a shoemaker, and he and his young family were very poor. Their second child died 6 weeks after his birth, his mother, Sarah, still only being 18 years old. The family seemed to recover a little in the next few years, as 2 more healthy children were born and survived, but in the early 1840s, when London was hit by another depression, the effects on the young Whitehair family were fatal. Sarah and Peter had 2 more children who each died in their first year. At about the same time, Peter died in the infirmary at St Pancras, and 1 year later his wife also died, aged only 34, and leaving behind 4 children aged between 18 and 5 to look after themselves. The eldest of these children, my ancestor, William Robert Whitehair, was a plasterer, and presumably he looked after the younger members as much as he could. His younger brother, 14-year-old Charles, went into the Camden workhouse for a few years before also working as a plasterer, but he eventually died in poverty in a workhouse. 12-year-old Elizabeth looked after the 5-year-old Frederick for a couple of years before he was put into the Camden Poor Law Hospital. Elizabeth went on to marry at 19 and to have 8 children. Frederick left the Poor Law Hospital as a teenager, and he also had a large family, working as a whitesmith south of London. Such was the life of poor Londoners at this time. In 1849, eldest brother William, now 21, married Jane Upton, a fruit seller who was just 18. After a few years, the couple decided to leave the grinding poverty of inner London and to emigrate to Australia. Following their marriage, William and Jane had 2 sons in quick succession, the elder one being William Joseph, my great-grandfather. 7 years later, in 1856, they sailed to Sydney as assisted immigrants. Jane must have been pregnant when their journey began, as she had her 3rd child, a daughter, while they were on board the ship. They arrived in Sydney in January 1856. Shipping information shows that neither parent could write, but that Jane could at least read. It also shows that both were Anglican, though at some later stage the family became Catholic. After spending a couple of years in Paddington, where William looked for work as a plasterer and Jane had a 4th child, they decided to look for work and better conditions in the country. In 1862, they travelled to Yass, with Jane having her 5th child on the long journey there. Over the next 10 years, William found work around Yass, while Jane raised the family and had 5 more children, bringing the total number of children to 10. At this time, Yass was a small country town, barely 30 years old. The original buildings in the main street, many of which still stand today, would have been built around this time, providing plenty of work for a skilled plasterer like William. The Mechanics' Institute, an early post office, hotels, churches, banks and shops were all being built during this time, as well as many houses in the blocks behind the main street. Jane and her children, who had previously been living in slums or on board ship, would have enjoyed the open spaces and country air. However, this was not to last. Tragically, William died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1872, aged just 44. The Yass Courier of 16th of January 1872 commented,
"We regret to have to state that several cases of typhoid fever have occurred in Yass within the past few days, and that in one instance, that of Mr. William Whitehair Sr., a respectable and well-known townsman, it has proved fatal after a short illness. The deceased, although feeling unwell, was in town on Thursday and died on the following Sunday morning. He leaves a wife just recovered from a serious attack of colonial fever and a family of 10 children. A change in the weather is anxiously looked for in the hope that it may prevent the spread of fever and other ailments now prevalent."
After he died, William was buried in the Anglican cemetery in Yass, while his wife Jane was later buried in the Catholic section of Rookwood Cemetery. This suggests that the family became Catholic at some stage after their move to Surrey Hills. A later edition of the Yass Courier advertised that Jane was now taking in boarders, but life in Yass was a struggle for her. After a time, she took her family back to Sydney, where she ran a boarding house in Emerald Terrace, Terry Lane, off Albion Street in Surrey Hills. Like so many of the old lanes in Surrey Hills, this lane no longer exists, having been resumed for industrial use. At this time, Surrey Hills has been described as follows.
Throughout the length and breadth of the Surrey Hills were scores of small workshops, and by the end of the 1880s each lane and alley was filled with the clamour from blacksmith shops, flour mills, foundries, builders' supply yards, coal yards and galvanising works, and with the smells from livery stables, ginger beer makers, biscuit factories and steam laundries. And cutting through all of this was the unmistakable lingo of the dealers and the Chinese hawkers, announcing today's bargain in fresh rabbits, vegetables, fish, milk and clothes pegs.
It was also a dirty and unhealthy place.
Over 45% of all houses in Surrey Hills had either defective drains and sewer connections or inadequate sanitary facilities. Surrey Hills had 7 times fewer indoor toilets than the rest of Sydney, and a mere 8% of houses were properly protected against rising damp. Rooms were damp and poorly ventilated.
In a small lane off Albion Street, and very close to Elizabeth Street, Jane ran her boarding house while at the same time raising a large family. Jane must have wondered if she had perhaps returned to the slums of London that she and her husband had left behind. But the move that Jane and her husband William had made from London had ultimately been a successful one, as their children built successful lives and families of their own. By the time Jane Whitehair died in 1891, aged 60, most of her children had married, and she herself had 16 grandchildren living in nearby suburbs such as Paddington, Redfern and Surrey Hills itself. Almost all of the Whitehair family continued to live in Sydney and to live long lives, but there were a couple of exceptions. The eldest daughter, Jane Mary, who had been born on board the ship in which they had left England, had stayed in Yass, marrying an American, Thomas Townsend. She had 3 children, dying at 21 while giving birth to her only daughter, also named Jane. After this, Thomas took his young sons back to America, where he remarried a couple of years later. According to Whitehair family tradition, the elder son Billy and his wife Irene were musical comedy performers on the American stage, and at one time visited Australia with a touring company. The coming of moving pictures caused a decline in stage shows, and Billy died in New York in the 1930s. Another daughter, Emily, married John Corley from Bellambi. Their first 3 sons, born over the next 3 years, all died before they were a year old. 2 daughters, born after this, each survived to adulthood. By this time, the family had moved to a farm at Keerong, a small settlement near Lismore. However, Emily herself died, giving birth to her second daughter, also named Emily. At a young age, the 2 motherless daughters, Dora and Emily, went to live with their paternal grandmother in Bellambi. But misfortune continued for this family. The younger Emily also married a farmer, moving back to Keerong. She had 9 children there, but died giving birth to the last of these. The eldest of the Whitehair family was my great-grandfather, William Joseph Whitehair. He had been 21 when his family moved to Sydney after the death of his father in Yass, and he had already lived a very eventful life. William had been born in the slums of London in St Pancras, and he had sailed out to Sydney when he was 4 years old, so he would have had some memories of his 104-day trip from England as a small boy. William and his family would have had to endure storms at sea, with huge waves breaking over the decks of the ship. He would have seen many people suffering from seasickness. The equatorial heat would have been fierce for William, and he would have seen people stripping off their clothes in ways not done at home. William would have seen all sorts of sickness, as well as women having children, many of whom died and were thrown into the sea. Happier events would have been mixing with the sailors, climbing the ship ropes, and seeing porpoises leaping through the seas. Food would have been dull and monotonous, varied at times by the fish they caught and large birds they had shot. In the final stages, William and his family would have had to adapt to the cold trade winds of the south, creating waves like mountains. William had grown up in Yass, leaving school at the end of primary school to become an apprentice compositor at the Yass Courier. When his father died of typhoid fever, William was just 20, the eldest of a family of 10, and he helped his mother Jane to move the young family to Surrey Hills. William then joined the typographical staff of the Sydney Morning Herald. A few years later, he married a young Irish woman, Sarah Jane Eager, known as Jenny Eager, in St Francis de Sales Catholic Church, Albion Street, Surrey Hills. Jenny had been born at High Park Estate in Wicklow in Ireland, where her father served as manager of the estate. As a 16-year-old, she came out to Sydney with her elder brother and settled in Yass, but when she found out that she was to be a housekeeper for her uncle, she fled to Sydney on a Cobb & Co coach and survived there as a milliner. Within a few years, she had married William Whitehair and had a baby daughter called Alice, who was my grandmother. Jenny's family, being staunch Protestants, strongly opposed Jenny marrying William, a Catholic, and none of Jenny's family members attended her wedding. Over the next 17 years, William and Jenny had 8 children together. During this time, William worked at first on the companion evening paper to the Herald called The Echo, a paper founded in 1857 and closing in 1893. After this, William was appointed overseer of the day staff of the Herald Typographical Department, a position he held for another 26 years till he retired in 1919 at the end of World War I. During these years, William's large family grew up, renting in various places in Surrey Hills till they found a permanent home in a house they named Melrose in Gibson Street, Waverley. In their earlier years, living in rented places in Surrey Hills and Paddington, they experienced their fair share of tragedy. The dense and unhealthy living conditions in the poorer parts of these suburbs provided an environment where diseases could flourish. In 1887, Mary, the youngest daughter of William and Jenny, died in her first year. In the next couple of decades, the main concern was tuberculosis, a disease that flourished in confined and crowded neighbourhoods with poor sanitation. At this time, 1/3 of the deaths of people aged between 20 and 40 were due to tuberculosis. William's brother Edward died from it in 1898, and another two of William's daughters from it, Emily in 1901, aged 22, and Winifred in 1923, aged 39. Only 2 of the 5 Whitehair daughters survived to raise a family of their own. Two of the Whitehair sons served in World War I, Augustine, better known as Gus, and William. Gus enlisted at the end of 1915, aged 27, having previously been a member of the Rifle Reserve in Waverley. A month later, his younger brother, William Aloysius, aged 21, also a volunteer member of the local militia, joined up. The brothers served on the Western Front and survived the war, Gus earning a military medal for bravery in the field. When they had enlisted, they had both been working as compositors in the Herald office, where their father was the foreman, and they returned to these positions after the war as their father was moving into retirement. William Joseph Whitehair lived on for another 11 years in the family home Melrose, where he died on the 24th of March 1930. His obituary stated,
"Yesterday morning, the death occurred at his residence at Bondi after a paralytic seizure of Mr. William Whitehair Sr., who was for many years in the service of the Sydney Morning Herald, retiring at the end of 1919. Mr. Whitehair, who was 78 years of age, learned the printing trade at Yass, and coming to Sydney in 1874, obtained a position in the typographical department of the Herald. He was for some years employed on the Echo, an evening newspaper that the older generation will remember was from 1875 to 1893 published from this office. When it ceased publication, Mr. Whitehair was appointed overseer of the day staff of the Herald typographical department, a position that he retained till his retirement, rendering faithful service to his employers and being generally esteemed by the various staffs. His wife, 2 daughters and 3 sons survive him, the daughters being Mrs. A. Barry, Yass, and Mrs. F. Cull, Wollstonecraft, and the sons, Messrs. A. Gus Whitehair, E. Whitehair, and W. Whitehair. The last named and a brother of the deceased, Mr. Frank Whitehair, are employees of the Herald. The funeral will leave Mary Immaculate Church, Waverley, at 10 a.m. today for Rookwood Cemetery.
William had experienced a very varied life. Born in the slums of London, he had travelled to Sydney as a 4-year-old, grown up in Yass as the eldest of a large family, returned to Sydney to live in the slums of Surrey Hills, found a very respectable job, and had had a large family of his own. It's interesting to note that none of his children who married had more than 3 children. William's wife Jenny lived on till 1941, dying when she was aged 85. Like her husband, she had experienced a life of many changes. Growing up in a serving family of an Irish country estate, she had travelled, accompanied by her elder brother, and perhaps against her will, to Sydney and then on to rural Yass. Apparently a high-spirited young lady, she had escaped from Yass to marry William and to raise a large family. She must have been devastated by the deaths of her 3 daughters, though she would have been very relieved when her 2 sons returned uninjured from World War I. She died in my grandmother Alice's place in Randwick. My grandmother Alice was the only one of her family to move back from Sydney to the country, and surprisingly it was back to Yass where her grandparents had first settled. Although she preferred Sydney to Yass, she had married a blacksmith, Gus Barry, whose father and grandfather had each been the main blacksmiths in Yass since the early 1840s. Gus and Alice were married in April 1914, 6 months before the First World War broke out. During the war years, Gus stayed in Yass, running his blacksmith shop located in the main street of Yass. Unlike his father and grandfather, Gus was able to purchase a house out of town, so the family was not required to live next to the blacksmith shop with all the dangers of sickness that it could cause. Alice had her first child, Mari, during World War I. Meanwhile, Alice kept in regular contact with her own family back in Sydney. She was a shy person who did not find it easy to make friends in a country town. Like almost all wives, her standard of living would be tied to her husband's fortunes. After the war in the 1920s, cars began to take over from horses, and while some blacksmiths were able to adjust by becoming motor mechanics, Gus was not able to do this. He was more interested in reading and music, playing the cornet in a brass band. He also had 2 more daughters to support, Joan and my mother, Alice. By the time of the Depression, Gus and his family were in grave financial difficulties. In 1935, his business went bankrupt and the family were evicted from their home, moving back to Sydney to stay with Alice's sister. Gus rented a shop in Bondi where he ran a lending library, while the family lived upstairs. However, this venture also failed. Mari was already working as a teacher and contributing to the family's income, but the 2 younger girls were also required to leave school early to bring in money for the family. Gus's lending library was not a success in these difficult financial times, and within a couple of years it too went bankrupt. At this time, Gus left the family, arguing to my mother that Alice would receive more money from a deserted wives' pension than they could from unemployment benefits. A few years later, Gus married again to a younger woman without children. He died in 1954. His brother-in-law later related that Gus never spoke about his earlier life, and that when he died, he owned nothing more than the clothes that he wore. Alice and her 3 daughters continued to live in rented flats till the mid-1950s, by which time each daughter had married and, like so many families of this time, had moved to live in the emerging outer suburbs of Seven Hills, Sutherland and Oatley. My grandmother Alice Barry lived on till the mid-1960s. I remember her as a small old woman, bent over with curvature of the spine. She was a gentle and loving grandmother, always passing on a few 2-shilling coins to allow me to buy books. Among the Dewsalls, the Whitehairs and the Barrys, there is a pattern where from time to time family members are able to rise out of poverty before later members slip back into it, either through sickness or economic misfortune. Many family members showed considerable resilience in their ability to rise from poverty or even to simply survive it and provide a better life for their children. The early Dewsalls seem to have been poor peasants, until Edward and his nephew John went to London and found opportunities there. The descendants of John Dewsall appeared to sink back into poverty for reasons that are unclear. Once again, a Dewsall descendant, Sarah Churchill, fled to London where she hoped for a better life with Peter Whitehair. However, sickness and poverty defeated them, and they both died young, leaving children to fend for themselves. Again, young family members looked to travel elsewhere to improve their life opportunities. Young William Robert Whitehair and his wife Jane made the long journey to Sydney and then on to Yass. Here they seemed to have opportunities to prosper, but the early death of William left his young, large family in a precarious position. Jane, however, in a remarkable display of resilience, brought her family back to Surrey Hills, where they were able to survive and go on to live relatively prosperous lives. Eldest son William Joseph was a good example of this, becoming a key figure in the daily production of the Sydney Morning Herald. However, there was still further economic misfortune. William's eldest daughter, my grandmother, married a man whose occupation as blacksmith could not survive the onset of the Great Depression. Alice lost her home and her marriage and was only able to raise her family of 3 daughters with great difficulty. Once again, though, family members were able to arise from these difficulties, each daughter contributing to their family's survival and then going on to live a more prosperous life. I admire the resilience and the determination of these ancestors. Some of them had miserable lives, and some had very short lives. Some of them had children who died very young, and whose lives must have been haunted by these early deaths. All of them had lives that were harder than mine. They are ancestors to be proud of.